On the outskirts of snowy Anchorage, Alaska, amidst the pale daylight, a heart-stopping scene unfolded. 6 enormous gray wolves lay motionless in the blood-soaked snow. Their breathing was barely perceptible, and right at the door of an old wooden hut, one, the largest, rose on its hind legs and folded its front paws, as if in prayer. Before him stood Matthew Anderson, an old hermit miner. His mouth gaped in horror. He had never seen a wolf prey and had no idea that this very minute would be the beginning of a miracle that would change the fate of the entire Alaskan settlement. Winter in Alaska could be merciless. By January, Anchorage and the surrounding forests transformed into a vast white expanse, where pines stood like marble columns and Lake Iliamna was frozen under a thick crust of ice. The day was short. The sun rose lazily and dimly, barely piercing through the grey clouds, and seemed more like a pale coin than a luminary. The frost crunched underfoot, breath turned into clouds of steam, and the air rang with silence. On the edge of this edge, among the snow-covered trees, stood an old hut. It once belonged to a lumberjack, but now it was a refuge for one elderly man. Matthew Anderson was a tall man, already stooped under the weight of years and memories. He was 70. He once worked as a miner in the Appalachian Mountains. For many years, he descended into the darkness of the mines, where coal dust ate into his skin and his hands were covered with calluses. The work made him resilient, but also drained his strength. His hair had turned grey early, and now he wore it short, and a long, thick grey beard hid a firm chin. He dressed simply, a warm sheepskin work vest, an old winter hat with torn fur on one ear, and heavy boots for walking in the snow. After the death of his wife, Elizabeth, a modest woman with a soft voice who passed away quietly from illness, Matthew withdrew. He had no children, and from this, the loneliness became almost unbearable. His character was strict but fair. He rarely smiled, but knew how to listen and help, though he avoided people, choosing the silence of the forest over conversations in town. That day, he sat by the stove, poking a log with a poker, listening to the wind howl hollowly. Snow was falling in flakes, but no longer with the same fury as the night before, but lazily, swirling in the cold air currents. The day was drawing to a close, but the light remained grey and transparent. Suddenly, he heard thump, 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 as if someone was scratching at the door with claws. He frowned, got up, walked to the heavy oak door, and placed his palm against the wood. The rustle repeated. Then he cautiously opened the door a crack. His eyes widened. On the white snow right by the porch lay 7 wolves. Their fur was thick, grey, stained in places with blood and ice. 6 animals lay motionless. Their breathing was barely perceptible. The snow around was stained with red spots, but one stood out. An enormous wolf with a powerful chest and gleaming fur rose on its hind legs. Its front paws were folded together, as if in prayer. Amber eyes looked directly at Matthew, not with the ferocity of a wild beast, but with the plea of a living creature. The old man froze. His mouth slightly open, he even took a step back. His heart pounded. In his childhood, he had been told fairy tales about werewolves and forest spirits, and now he remembered them with unexpected intensity. But along with the horror came another feeling: compassion. He did not see predators before him. Before him were soldiers after a battle, wounded and broken. Matthew hesitated for only a moment, then quietly muttering, "Lord, what is this?" He flung the door wider. Warm air, the scent of firewood and soup, wafted from the hut. The wolves did not rush, did not growl. They lay motionless, only breathing heavily. The one standing lowered its paws and took a tiny step forward, as if confirming, "We have not come to kill." The old man slowly stepped onto the porch. Snow crunched under his boots. He leaned towards the nearest animal, a young one, with a slender body and fur matted together. On the wolf's neck was a deep wound, as if from a metal collar. The animal's eyes were closed, but its eyelashes trembled. Matthew exhaled heavily. "You are wounded. Who did this to you?" He mumbled and began to carefully drag the first wolf closer to the door, then the second. It seemed impossible to him, but strength seemed to return to his old body, as if fate itself had given him a task. One by one, he dragged the wolves inside, laying them by the stove on old rugs and blankets. The hut became cramped, but the warmth and the scent of pine in the animal's fur filled the cabin. The very wolf with the amber eyes, Matthew could see him better now, was larger than the others. His fur was thick, a scar across his snout through one eye. His paws were also scratched. But he stood upright, and his gaze was wise, calm. The wolf stepped in last, like a commander, making sure the others were safe. The old man closed the door, added more logs to the fire, and sat down again on the stool, wiping his sweaty brow. He couldn't believe it was all real. In his hut, 7 wounded wolves now breathed, and among them one who could stand and pray. At that time in the village, near the church, on the bank of the frozen Knik River, an old woman named Barbara lit a candle. She was 75. She was tall, lean, with a long face and strict but kind eyes. Barbara had lived in Anchorage her whole life, widowed at 40, and had been helping in the temple ever since. She was known for always making an extra portion of soup or bread for those in need. That day, when the sun hung as a dull disk over the forest, Barbara suddenly felt a stir of unease. She lifted her head from the candles and whispered, "Someone up there needs the Lord's light." The woman put aside the bowl, took a pot, poured salmon chowder cooked with potatoes into it, and placed it on the table next to rye bread. Tomorrow morning, she decided, she would take it to old Matthew, living alone in the forest. She didn't know why, but her heart told her, he is the one who needs warmth right now. And in the hut, the old man sat and watched the fire. The wolves lay by the stove, steam rising from their damp fur. Their breathing was heavy but alive. The amber leader's gaze met his eyes again, and Matthew felt a strange sensation, as if he was back among miners, where everyone covered a comrade's shoulder. And as if this wolf wanted to say, "Now we will cover yours. Cover." He ran a hand through his beard and whispered, "Well then, we are together now." Morning in Alaska began harshly. The sun slowly rose over the frozen lake Iliamna, painting the sky a pale pink. But the cold remained piercing, as if the air itself wanted to remind them that spring was still far away. In Matthew Anderson's cabin, there was the smell of smoke, damp fur, and old wood. The old man, barely opening his eyes, felt a steady gaze upon him. The wolf with the amber eyes, the one who had stood on his hind legs yesterday, sat directly opposite the stove and watched him. His name was Wolf. The name came to Matthew's mind instantly, as if it had always been associated with this beast. Wolf was large, his fur thick and in places darkened with blood. His chest was covered in scars. One ear was torn, giving him the appearance of a warrior who had survived dozens of battles. In his eyes lived a cautious wisdom. He did not attack, but he did not lose his vigilance either. He sat upright, like a sentry at the door. Matthew leaned towards another wolf. He had christened her Snow White for her soft silver fur, which in the daylight seemed as white as snow. She was smaller than Wolf, graceful with a delicate snout and large eyes, but her hind leg dragged on the floor like a heavy burden. There was a deep mark from an iron ring, and the old man understood she had been chained for a long time. Snow White whimpered softly when he carefully touched the wound, but she did not move away. On the contrary, she lowered her head as if trusting him. Nearby, curled up in a ball, lay a young wolf whom Matthew named Artem. He was slender, with short, darker fur. His ears were constantly alert. His eyes never rested. He watched every movement in the room, looked towards the window, flinched at the crackling of the logs. Artem was like a sentry in a military camp, and the old man involuntarily remembered his service in the mine, when one always stood at the entrance to the workings, listening for a possible collapse. On another rug, the long and bony Bogdan stretched out. His body was so thin that his ribs protruded from under his wet fur. He breathed frequently. It was clear that each breath was difficult for him. In his eyes, however, there was no submission. They sparkled with a stubborn fire. Bogdan resembled a pauper who, despite hunger, would not bend. Matthew looked at him and murmured, "You are a living fighter, son." Lady, a wolf with grizzled fur, lay motionless. Her shoulder was bloody. The wound was fresh, ragged, like a knife mark or a metal rod. Her breathing was intermittent, but her gaze remained soft and warm, as if, despite the pain, she was trying to calm the others. Matthew felt that in her eyes there was a feminine kindness, the same as his Elizabeth had when she pressed sick kittens to her chest in the yard. Next to Lady, on an old blanket, lay 2 small wolf cubs. Their fur was not yet thick. Thin skin showed through, their breathing was weak. They were so young that they might have experienced snow and pain for the first time simultaneously. Matthew felt a pang of pity looking at them. He quietly said, "Little ones, why were you treated like this?" He noticed something common in all of them. Each wolf had an iron mark on its neck, a deep furrow in the skin like a dark collar of memory. The old man frowned in thought. "These are not just animals," he told himself. "These are prisoners. They were tormented by humans." He took an old first aid kit from a chest, a relic from the Korean War. Inside were bandages, iodine, a piece of gauze. He did his best to clean the wounds, bandage their paws, and apply cloths soaked in warm water. The wolves did not resist. Wolf even closed his eyes when Matthew treated his side. Snow White merely flinched, but did not pull her paw away. Meanwhile, in the village lived a boy named Elijah. He was 12 years old, thin, with unruly dark hair and dreamy green eyes. Elijah grew up without a father. He had died on a fishing vessel in the Bering Sea when the boy was only 3 years old. His mother worked as a saleswoman in a shop. A strict but fair woman, Elijah himself was quiet, often sitting by the window and drawing. His favorite drawings were wolves. He saw them in pictures, in books, sometimes heard their howling outside the village. And in his imagination, they were not monsters, but mysterious guardians of the forest. When his teacher asked him to draw his family, Elijah depicted not people, but a pack of wolves standing together, covering each other. The teacher only sighed, deciding that the boy lacked a male figure in the home. That day, Elijah went for a walk on the snowy road. He noticed tracks, heavy boot prints of Matthew leading into the forest, and nearby strange paw prints, deep and confused. Curiosity overcame fear. He put on his old down jacket, tied a red scarf over it, and, hiding his hands in his pockets, trudged down the path. The frost nipped at his cheeks, but excitement ignited within him. He reached the edge of the forest and hid behind a snowdrift. In the distance, by the hut, he saw smoke and faint silhouettes. Elijah squinted. Near the door, old Matthew was bending over, lifting something heavy, and nearby a wolf's tail flashed. The boy held his breath. He saw Matthew covering the animals with blankets, pushing a bowl of water towards them. Elijah's eyes widened. In his mind, the old man suddenly transformed into a fairy tale hero, almost like Santa Claus from old stories. Only not stern but kind. A real snow wizard, he whispered to himself. At that moment, the boy realized that legends of miracles had not died. He stood there for a long time until the frost nipped at his hands. Then he quietly retreated, deciding not to tell anyone. This would be his secret. In the hut, Matthew continued to care for the pack. He was tired, his hands trembling from weight and age, but in his soul, for the first time in many years, something new ignited, a feeling of purpose. He looked at the wolves and saw not wildness, but living souls as tired of pain as he himself was. He whispered, "You have been through hell, but now you are here. Perhaps together, we will find peace." Midday in Alaska was as cold as the morning. Only the sky became a little brighter. Sunbeams broke through the bare pine crowns, casting long striped shadows on the snow cover. Matthew Anderson stepped onto the porch, pulling his hat lower, and immediately noticed something strange. On the snow, packed around the cabin, there were not only his own footprints and wolf paw prints, but also other marks, heavy, clear, deep. These were military boot prints. They went in a circle, as if someone had circled his house several times, lingering by the window and near the shed. A little further, 2 parallel furrows stretched, wheel tracks from a vehicle, likely a truck. The tires left a distinct tread pattern that the old man knew well. Such tires were fitted on military SUVs. Matthew froze. A troubling feeling squeezed his chest. He had lived away from people for many years and knew animals don't behave like this. These are human tracks. He remembered the wounds on the wolves' necks, the metallic furrows from collars, and understood. Someone was looking for them, someone was on their trail. Returning to the house, he was surprised at how the leader, Wolf, immediately took up a position by the window. His powerful figure froze. His ears were alert, his eyes intently watched the forest. Artem sat by the door, stretched out like a sentry. His small body was tense, his paws clutching the floorboard, and he never took his eyes off the doorknob. Even the thin Bogdan, still weak, stood up and shuffled to the corner where the logs were stacked, gripped a dry branch with his teeth, and dragged it to the stove. Snow White lay by the threshold, covering the pups with her body. Lady slightly raised her head. Her eyes were tired but full of determination. Matthew watched this with a tremor. Everything happened so organized, as if the wolves were real soldiers who didn't need words. He remembered minor brigades where everyone knew their place. One listened for cracks in the rock, another checked tools, a third stood guard. The wolves acted the same way. The old man whispered, "You are not wild, you were trained." But why and by whom? He ran a hand through his beard and for the first time in many years felt a cold fear not of nature, but of people. Meanwhile, in Anchorage, at the local police department building, a young officer named Anne Morgan was stacking papers on her desk. She was 28 years old. She was a tall girl with light brown hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and clear grey-blue eyes. Her face was pale, a little tired, but her features were strict and regular. She wore a new uniform, slightly too large at the shoulders, and her collar was neatly buttoned all the way to her neck. Anne had recently transferred from New York, where she had started her service as a patrol officer. She had a difficult experience in the city. One day, before her eyes, a gang of teenagers attacked a woman in an alley, and Anne intervened alone, for which she received a knife wound to her arm. Since then, a thin white scar remained on her forearm, and with it, a firm rule: never turn away from trouble. Her character was formed on this. She was persistent, honest, but also cautious. She did not believe empty words and always sought evidence. This morning, she heard strange talk in the village. They said a whole pack of wolves had been seen in the forest near the lake, but they behaved like trained animals. Someone claimed the animals hardly attacked, but on the contrary, stayed together. Others laughed, dismissing it as tall tales. Anne, however, became wary. Too many coincidences. She mustered her courage and went to report to her chief, Victor Smith, a man in his 50s. Smith was short, stout, with a round face and small, cunning eyes. He had thick moustaches, grey at the ends, and a habit of twirling his office keys in his hands. He wore a uniform with worn lieutenant's insignia. He had served since the Vietnam War, survived the collapse of the system, and now clung to his chair with all his might. People in town knew Smith was not cruel, but he knew how to pretend not to notice things if it benefited him. Anne entered and, gathering herself, reported, "Sir, residents are complaining about the appearance of wolves on the outskirts. They say they were seen near the old cabin. Their behavior is unusual. Perhaps it's worth checking." Smith looked up at her, grunted and smirked. "Wolves, Morgan. Do you believe village tales? Here in Alaska, there have always been wolves. What's new about that? We have more than enough work as it is." He waved his hand as if swatting away an annoying fly. Anne pressed her lips together but said nothing. She noticed how he sharply averted his gaze as if trying to hide his irritation. Her heart told her, he knows more than he's saying. She left the office and stopped in the corridor. A board with police photographs hung there. In an old yellowed picture from 20 years ago, Anne noticed a young Smith, slender with a hard gaze. Around him stood police dogs, German shepherds, during training. So that's it, she thought. He knows too well what training is. Meanwhile, Elijah, the same boy, returned home. In the evening, he sat at the table with a pencil for a long time. A new picture appeared in his notebook. An old man with a long beard, wolves around him, and a thin circle of sun in the sky above them. He himself was surprised at how confidently he drew the lines. His mother, tired after work, glanced at it and only said, "You're always with your animals. If only you loved your textbooks as much." But there was no strictness in her voice, only weariness. Matthew, however, sat by the stove, thoughtfully gazing at the flames. Questions swirled in his head. Who had been circling the cabin? Whose boots had left the tracks? Why did the wolves act like soldiers? He stroked the head of one of the wolf cubs and whispered, "If they come for you, we'll have to defend ourselves." Wolf, as if he heard, raised his head and growled softly, looking towards the window where the sunlight cut across the white snowdrifts. The old man understood. This was only the beginning. After a disturbing morning, when the old man discovered boot and tire tracks, the silence around the cabin deepened. During the day, snow continued to fall in thick flakes, covering the forest in a white veil. The wind had died down, and every sound became clearer. Matthew Anderson sat on a stool by the door, clutching an old hunting rifle he hadn't touched in years. It was from World War II. The barrel was scratched, the wood darkened with age, but the weapon remained functional. The old man understood that if those who left the tracks returned, the conversation would be short. The wolves, as if sensing their owner's anxiety, also remained on guard. Artem lay by the door, but his body was tense. His ears twitched constantly. Wolf, with the heavy gaze of a commander, stood by the window. His chest rose evenly and slowly. Snow White moved with difficulty through the cabin, but did not stray from the pups. Only occasionally did she raise her snout and growl towards the forest. Towards evening, when the light became golden and dim, a sound pierced the silence, a metallic clang, as if something heavy had struck iron. Matthew frowned, opened the door and looked out. Dark figures appeared from the white wall of the forest. There were 5 of them, all in identical black winter jackets with hoods, their faces covered with scarves. Only their eyes gleamed. They walked confidently, one after another, and each carried something in their hands. Nets of strong wire, long poles with loops at the ends, weapons resembling dart rifles. In front walked a broad-shouldered man, about 50 years old. His face was sharp, his cheekbones angular, his eyes dark and cold, his hair dark with graying temples, neatly trimmed. On his right cheek was a long scar stretching from his ear to his chin, and on his lips a mocking half-smile. This was Roman Kramer, about whom rumors spread throughout Alaska. He once served in the internal troops, held the rank of captain, but after his discharge, he took up a dubious business. He organized secret camps where dogs and even wolves were trained for underground fights and guarding illegal objects. They said he was cruel, but incredibly skilled. He rarely raised his voice, but his orders were carried out instantly. The men who followed him were his crew, sturdy men with rough hands, their faces weathered and tanned, like those who spend their lives in the taiga. Matthew stepped back into the cabin, raised his rifle, and said hoarsely, "God help me." At that moment, the wolves were already in position. Bogdan, despite his thinness and fatigue, stood up, arched his back, and growled. His ribs heaved, but his gaze was ferocious. He was the first to strike. When one of the men approached with a net, Bogdan lunged forward and crashed powerfully into his legs. The man, not expecting it, fell into the snow, and the net slipped from his hands. Snow White, limping but unyielding, sprang up and sank her teeth into the rope, tearing it. Metal screeched, but the loop broke. Wolf rose on his hind legs, enormous, menacing, and with a deafening roar, he stood between Matthew and the attackers. His eyes blazed, his fur stood on end. He was like a living wall. Lady, severely wounded, barely got up, but gritting her teeth, lay over the 2 wolf cubs, covering them with her body. Her eyes closed in pain, but her ears listened to every movement. Kramer smirked and said in a low voice, "There you are. I knew you wouldn't go far." He raised his hand, and his men moved forward. Matthew, with trembling hands, raised his rifle and fired into the air. The roar echoed over the forest. Snow showered down from the branches. The wolves howled simultaneously. The attackers paused for a second, but were already preparing to charge again. And then, in broad daylight, the silence was cut by the sound of a siren. Piercing, confident. A police car emerged through the trees. Its flashing lights tore through the snowy darkness with blue and red. People in uniform got out. In front was Anne Morgan. She wore a winter police jacket, a belt with a holster, and a hat with a badge. Her face was serious, her eyes tense, but a fire of determination burned in them. Behind her were 2 older policemen. One was a stout man with a thick mustache, the other young, stooped but strong. Kramer cursed, waved his hand. His men, understanding that they couldn't handle armed opponents in broad daylight, quickly began to retreat. One of them stumbled, fell, and a small plastic card was left in the snow, an ID card stained with blood, likely from his pocket. Anne raised her pistol and shouted, "Stop!" But Kramer merely smirked, cast a heavy gaze at her, and disappeared into the forest with the others. Matthew stood on the porch, still holding the rifle. His heart pounded as it had in his youth when he climbed out of the mine after an accident. The wolves were nearby, alert but not defeated. Anne approached him, their gazes met. She nodded briefly, as if acknowledging the old man wasn't crazy. It was all true. She noticed the card in the snow, picked it up and looked at it. No inscriptions, only a black stripe and a bloodstain. "This will be evidence," she said. Meanwhile, in the village, Barbara knelt in the small church by the lake. She whispered a prayer, and her dry hands trembled. Inside her, there was a feeling as if someone above had already answered. "The light reached where it was needed," she whispered, and crossed herself. When everything was quiet, Matthew returned to the house. The wolves lay down, breathing heavily but close to him. He looked at the map, then at the fire in the stove, and understood. This story is just beginning. There will be more dangers ahead, but he is no longer alone. The winter sun hung low through the clouds. It shone a pale circle, reflecting in the icy expanse of Lake Iliamna. Following the tracks left by the fugitives, Matthew and Anne reached an old warehouse that once served as a sawmill. Now it was a dilapidated building of grey timber and rusted iron, surrounded by weeds covered in snow. A crooked sign hung at the entrance, on which the words "Forest Warehouse" could barely be read. The boards on the walls creaked. The doors hung on a single hinge, as if the earth itself refused to keep this secret. Anne walked ahead, pistol in hand. Her steps were confident. Steam escaped from her mouth in the cold air. Her eyes were tense but determined. She knew that behind this silence lay the truth. Matthew walked beside her, staying closer to the wall, his rifle pressed to his chest. Wolf walked first, ears alert, fur bristling. Snow White and Bogdan followed him, and Artem brought up the rear, constantly looking back. Lady dragged her injured shoulder but did not fall behind. The wolf cubs trembled under the blanket, wrapped by Matthew and hidden in a bag on his back. When they entered, a smell hit them. Rust, mold, and something else. Blood. In the depths of the hall stretched rows of iron cages, some open, others locked with rusty padlocks. Stains of dried blood and clumps of fur were visible on the floor. Chains dangled, clinking with every gust of wind. Matthew frowned, clutching his rifle tighter. In the corner, behind a stack of boards, a faint squeak was heard. Wolf was the first to rush there, stopped and growled softly. Not aggressively, but warningly. Matthew and Anne approached closer. There, among the sawdust and debris, lay two tiny wolf cubs. Their fur was dirty, matted. Their bodies trembled with cold. Their eyes barely opened, their breathing intermittent. One of the cubs stretched out a paw on which there was a fresh wound, as if from a metal snare. The other was so weak that it barely moved. Snow White, limping, crawled up first. She lowered her snout and whimpered softly, as if coaxing the little ones not to give up. Lady, overcoming the pain, lay down beside them, pressing them to her. Her chest rose and blood seeped again from the wound, but she did not move away. The cubs pressed against their bodies, and for the first time their breathing became steadier. Matthew closed his eyes. He understood that this was the miracle, sacrifice for the weak. Anne took out her phone, took a few pictures. This evidence will be substantial. Something terrible was happening here. She inspected the cages and found a metal box with documents and a black folder. Inside were lists of animals, dates, incomprehensible codes. On one of the pages was Victor Smith's signature. Matthew exhaled heavily. He knew this man as a police officer, but now everything became clear. Anne, frowning, said, "This is enough to strip him of his badge." Her voice was firm, and anger could be heard in it. Meanwhile, in the city itself, Smith sat in his office, flipping through a newspaper. A glass of strong coffee and a plate of salted pretzels were on the table. His face seemed calm, but his fingers tapped nervously on the table. He was waiting for a call. But instead of a call, two stern-faced officers entered the door. "Victor, come with us," said the elder, a tall man with thick eyebrows. Smith tried to object, but Anne was already standing in the doorway with the folder in her hands. She held up the documents and said, "Your signatures are here. It's over." Smith's face paled. He tried to smirk, but the corners of his mouth twitched. "Nay, I was only protecting order," he began, but the words sounded hollow. Handcuffs clicked, and the silence in the office became heavier than any scream. Winter passed. The sun grew warmer. The snow on the banks of the Knik River began to melt, and the first grasses broke through the earth. A small shelter grew where Matthew's old hut once stood. It was modest: a wooden fence, lean-tos for protection from rain, a few cages for temporary housing of sick animals. A sign hung on the gate, carved by Matthew himself and painted by Elijah. Northern Haven. It depicted paws and the sun. Wolf took his place on the porch. He sat upright, ears alert, eyes gazing into the distance. Children from the village who came to visit called him Old General. He took them seriously, didn't scare them, but also didn't allow too much noise. Snow White, still limping, loved to sit next to lonely elderly people who came to the shelter. She would lie at their feet and they would stroke her fur, telling their stories in quiet voices. For them, she was not a wolf, but a confidant. Artem became a guide for the young wolf cubs. He ran with them along the bank, taught them to stay close, to stop at his signal. His keen eyes watched every movement. Bogdan, having recovered, sometimes brought sticks to the children and allowed them to play. His thin body had strengthened, and now he resembled a warrior who had returned from war but managed to find joy in peaceful life. Lady, with her gentle gaze, always approached children who were afraid of wolves. She gently placed her paw in their hand and the fear disappeared. Her eyes said, "I trust you." The wolf cubs, rescued from the warehouse, grew up. They were named Rainbow and Fog. The first was playful, with a white spot on its chest, always jumping and reaching for the sun. The second was calmer, with grey eyes, always following its brother. Matthew kept a notebook. He wrote his thoughts in it with a trembling hand. "On that cold day, I saw a wolf that prayed. I thought I was saving them, but perhaps they were saving me. God's miracles don't always come through ringing bells. Sometimes they look at you with amber eyes amidst snow and wind. Sometimes a miracle comes not with thunder and lightning, but in the silence of a winter day, when the gaze of a tired beast meets the gaze of a man. The Lord shows us that even in the coldest places there is room for warmth and mercy. The wolves found a home, and the old man found meaning in life again. So it is in our daily lives. If you open your heart, help and hope will surely come. Dear viewers, if this story touched your soul, share it with your loved ones. Write in the comments if you believe in God's miracles and second chances. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories of loyalty and hope. May the Lord bless you and your families every day.